go.
All right.
Remember your why.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Works.
Well, that doesn't.
Now go click just click the Facebook icon on the left. Actually, go to the right where the menu with the three drop down right there. Go down to Dr. Owen Anderson shortcut on the left. Okay. Should be yeah.
Newsfeed?
There you are.
Oh,
Live.
yeah.
Now hit share. Wait, stop real quick. See the little thing on the right? Click to you. Okay. Now share. Sure. Just, yeah, share now. Custom.
What? Oh, you can hear on Facebook? Okay.
Now you're on your profile. You want to go back and edit that and add something to the camera copy.
Oh, it's already on my profile?
You've already shared your profile. If you go back to your vision page, you have Facebook icon on the top left. Yeah, go down.
All right.
You can click on the top right here. Scroll up, top three buttons on the post itself.
No?
Sorry, go back. And then on the post itself there, on the little three things, hit edit post. And then you can write a post. Welcome people. And then to my phone, I'll take that and you know.
Okay.
Make it public.
You think so?
I think so.
All right.
It's free speech.
Now where, should we go back to the other one? Just leave this alone now, right?
Yeah, you're fine.
And go,
Go back to Facebook.
let's see, we want to be on Zoom.
I'll share it and read it myself.
Okay.
Record it.
Hey, as the audience, want to scoot down so I can see you, because I'm going to be up here mostly, and I'll point a little bit. We'll see if I'm glad you all could join us tonight. You may not be able to recognize me, but I'm Dr. Owen Anderson. Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and this is the first of our spring 2021 Philosophy Out West lecture series. And tonight we'll be talking about freedom of speech. Our 4 events this semester are on freedom of speech, freedom of dissent, common ground, and e pluribus unum. So tonight we're beginning with freedom of speech. Let me see if this helps. Yeah, that's a little better, right? Why do we need freedom of speech? I might ask some questions in the audience. We have both in-person audience and online audience. So why do we need freedom of speech? I wonder if we kind of take that for granted. It's a good thing to have freedom of speech. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say we don't need any freedom of speech. Part of the question is, when can we and when should we regulate freedom of speech? I'll pull up my doc. I'm going to make the case tonight that free speech And the right to free speech is both a right and also an obligation to rational dialogue. But that still leaves us with the question, why would you want to have rational dialogue? We currently seem to be in a place where we can't really communicate with each other. We don't talk to each other. We might talk about each other. And we say the worst kinds of things about each other. And we seem to believe them. It's not just like a fight where you say something mean because you're mad. We say pretty vicious things about people we disagree with, and we think that they're true. So why not just agree to split up? Isn't there a time where you have to call it quits? Say, you know what, we had a good run, we tried, we're just not working. It's me, it's not you. And we could split up and go our own separate ways. Why keep trying to force things? So I'm going to work tonight toward answering that question. Even the slide itself is divided. See that? The very PowerPoint is divided. So first, let's go back and think about different ways we might talk about or think about free speech. We could analyze it from the perspective of we're divided and can rarely have a productive dialogue. Have you ever tried that, to have a discussion with someone that you have you see the world completely differently? And maybe you can go for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and it just breaks down. You say, I can't take it. You're so wrong, I can't talk to you. Have you had that experience? I don't know how someone could get to be so wrong. So why should we even want to do that? So how should we consider free speech? When you see free speech discussed, you'll see it discussed from a couple of different areas. You might see it from free speech and the government. Maybe that's the first thing you think about is free speech and the First Amendment. Is that right? And you can look at famous, especially Supreme Court cases, but also states cases, and see how do they decide what counts as free speech. I have a number of them. And that might be what someone does for free speech discussion. So then they're thinking about it from the perspective of the government and what the government says we can and can't do. And we can go through and see, yeah, well, what has the government said? Reno versus the ACLU, 1997. The 1996 Communications Decency Act was ruled unconstitutional since it was overly broad and vague in its regulation of speech on the internet, and since it attempted to regulate indecent speech, which the First Amendment protects. So a lot of times that's the kind of examples you'll get. When are you free to use what could be considered offensive language, indecent language? And then you'll have the question, and then the governments come up with a kind of test to go through any case like that to see, is this an example of free speech we want to protect or not? And in those kind of cases, what the justices do is they have a proposed test in which a court must first decide whether the expression is fraudulent or illegal. So for example, especially in commercials, you don't have the right to advertise something that's illegal. That's the first question. And then you must decide whether or not the government has an interest, a substantial interest, in regulating the speech. Why does the government care about regulating it? And then, is it going to cause imminent harm to anyone? So you might be able to talk about things that hypothetically could lead to harm, but are you telling someone to do something which directly leads to harm? Hey, come on in. Imminent violence. Now, part of the question will be, or imminent danger, who gets to decide what counts as danger? In one obvious sense, it's just physical violence. But you could get into an area where ideas that people don't like count as causing harm or danger. So we can go through that. Now, we can look at different cases. Flag burning. How about draft card burning? Using an obscenity in court. Those are the kinds of things that they're debating at the government level. I'm going to suggest that while those might be interesting and important for some reasons, they're not getting to what we really want to do in free speech. And we could also look at free speech in the workplace. Do you have free speech in your workplace? You do? Oh, good. I wouldn't have thought you do. I know the people you work with. I'm just teasing. Yeah, what kinds of things are you free to talk about at work? And one example of protected speech is talking about your employer violating the law. So whistleblowing activities, where you say my employer is violating the law. You're free to talk about that with other employees, or to organize and talk about what to do about those kinds of things with other employees. Your employer can't tell you, stop talking about that. So this is what free speech often amounts to when people discuss free speech, these kinds of examples. Another way that we could look at it is free speech in the American founding. Why did we need it in the First Amendment? And the First Amendment has a preeminent place. It's the First Amendment. It's not just they had 10 things and they pulled them out. Oh, the first one is free speech. But if you don't have the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment, you really don't end up with much benefit from the other amendments. And think about what the things are in the First Amendment. Free speech, right to assemble, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. And those aren't just, they needed 4 things to put in there. Oh, we have 4 blank spots. Those all go together in an important way. I think they connect back up to this freedom of thought and the pursuit of the truth. And if you don't have the freedom of the press, or you don't have the right to assemble, the right to religious exercise, that doesn't mean do jumping jacks during, practice your religion, then you don't really have the freedom of thought, because thought doesn't occur in just an abstract bubble. It occurs in ways that we want to live our life out. So let's think about the First Amendment and founding. James Madison, free speech. In the Federalist Papers, this is from paper 10, he's worried about factions. And what do we do about a faction rising up and controlling the government? That's what we don't want to have happen. How do we protect against that? So he says a faction is a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or majority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. I'm going to, on my slides, I'm going to violate one of the most basic rules of slides, which is don't have long quotes. I have a few long quotes coming. This one's actually not that long compared to the others. I just put them out there so you'll be able to read along if you want to. So factions are set against each other. And this faction's understanding of how things should be done would be contrary to the rights of the other factions. And so what do we do about it? And he says there's a few things we can do. One is take away freedom. Freedom is to factions as air is to fire. But he says that's contrary to human nature. You can't take away freedom. Another option is to just ban them. Just as they form, you go in and stop them. And that's not practical either. So what about his solution is you set up factions against each other, and you have rules in place such that no faction is able to become a permanent majority over the others. And so you have, let's say, for example, Democrats and Republicans, and they kind of go back and forth, right? And neither one gets the permanent ascendancy. If that happened, you'd have just a permanent faction in charge of everyone else. And it is ruling for its own interests, not for the community interests. Now, keep this in mind, because this seems to require skepticism. There's an immediate sense in which factions are real and you have to deal with them. But the solution to factions in the long run, or even the medium run, is just come to have knowledge of the nature of things. Whatever it is these two factions are arguing about, they have some different opinions. Maybe they're both wrong, or one's right and one's wrong. Well, what if you just come to know the correct answer. Imagine, cast your mind back to ancient times, and there's the 2 + 2 is 4 faction, and the 2 + 2 is 5 faction. And they hate each other. And they can't get along. Well, the solution is to find out what the answer to 2 + 2 is. Right? So why do we have to think there'll always be factions? There might currently be factions, there were factions in his day, but why think there'll always be factions? Now, Jefferson. This is from the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. Well aware that the opinions and beliefs of men depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidences proposed to their minds, that, whereas God hath created the mind free and manifested his supreme will, that free it shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and our departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who, being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do, but to extend it by its influence on reason alone. So there's a lot there. Think about this. This especially has to do with freedom of religion, but they're closely connected. The freedom to speak about your opinions that other people might disagree with. And what he says is this: we don't have a free will over our beliefs, our opinions. Instead, they follow, they follow involuntarily the evidence proposed to our minds. I remember having a philosophy professor who said he couldn't believe in God because of all the evil in the world. So the evidence proposed to his mind was the reality of evil. And from there, he said, I would even like to believe in God. I just can't. He couldn't come to believe in God as long as that evidence was there. Now, one solution is to reinterpret that evidence, understand it differently. But that would be to change the evidence presented to your mind. And so, what if you were to try to force people to follow something contrary to the evidence proposed to their mind? Well, it won't work. The solution is that you're going to have to use reason to present a case to your fellow citizens, present evidence to their mind. And you might think what you have is a great argument, and they disagree, and they might be right. Just because you think you have a sound argument doesn't mean you do. So now we're getting into answering that question. Why should we want to dialogue together? Dialogos. Enter into the logos together. Remember that term. It's interesting. It says, temporal punishments and civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy. So if you have to go, let's say you have to go to church or you'll be fined. Well, you'll go to church, right? But you won't believe what you're hearing. You'll be a hypocrite. You'll keep the pew warm every Sunday to avoid a fine. Continue with Jefferson, that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than on our opinions in physics or geometry. Think about that. Our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions. Here he's going to introduce some of the same skepticism we saw in Madison. We can have civil rights, the rights given to us by the government, by the amendments, Bill of Rights. And it doesn't really matter what you believe in religion. Now, that just simply seems not to be true. Remember the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Because we're created, we have these rights. And that was largely written by Jefferson himself, right? So, how far can we press that? How far can we allow, permit, understand differences at that level and still retain these civil rights? So he says that to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency is a dangerous fallacy, which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he, being of course judge of that tendency, will make his opinions the rule of judgment and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only as they will square with or differ from his own. So if it comes down to a court case and there's a judge in charge, then the judge's opinions are going to be the ones that rule. And you wouldn't want that, is the idea, right? So, and the alternative is that freedom. But you see the same skepticism now from Madison to Jefferson, or vice versa. You can't know. It all comes down to a matter of opinion, the judge's opinion. Now, you wouldn't say that in these other disciplines that he names, physics and geometry. If there was differences of opinion in physics, and we present it to a senior professor, and that professor says, here's the answer, we'd say, well, that's just the professor's opinion. We'd say, well, they probably worked it out. Let's figure out how they worked it out, and we can do the same thing. So it's skepticism about the ability to do that in religion, especially. And what's going to be the consequence of that skepticism? And it says that it is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt actions against peace and good order. Remember I said at the beginning? Directly inciting to imminent violence. And finally, that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict, unless by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. So here, in this line, he's holding up argument and debate as what leads us to truth, which settles the matter. So we do get a method, and that method doesn't just apply in physics and geometry, it would apply in religious differences. Now, what's your sense from his time to now? Do we have more, greater, or lesser divisions in religion? Yeah, the audience here says greater. You could decide for yourself out there. Seems that's right, greater. So we haven't been putting that into practice, have we? We've been letting divisions come up and divide to a point where we can't even talk. We were given all these years of freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and we haven't used them. Now, what about Socrates as an example? Remember the case here I was drawing. Again, those quotes from Madison were Federalist Paper 10. From Jefferson are the Virginia Statute for religious freedom. Why do those two assume skepticism? I began by saying, I'm going to define freedom of speech as the right and the responsibility to rational discourse. Not only do you have this right, you have an obligation, a responsibility to think, to come to have knowledge. This obligation involves forming beliefs, examining your assumptions, and giving arguments to support your beliefs. It amounts to saying having integrity as a human. You have an obligation to do that. So going from the founding to the present, a significant amount of time, number of generations. How will we use that time? Have we used it to overcome the divisions and come to understand the truth of the matter? And if we haven't, if instead we've multiplied divisions, should we be surprised we don't have the basis to talk to each other as a natural consequence of not having done that? Now, arguments are more and less basic. And what I mean by that is, when we're looking at the cases, Supreme Court cases, there'd be things like obscenity, burning a religious symbol. I would say those aren't very basic. Those have a lot of assumptions. And what we want to do, we want to use our freedom to do, is get to the most basic, the foundational questions that divide us. Because imagine that. Imagine if you have, let's say, a foundational division, which gives rise to 10 others, they each give rise to 10 others. And you start to solve that third level. We haven't made much progress then, right? As opposed to getting to the most basic division that divides people, then you would have dealt with all those others also. And I very rarely see, as I look at the Supreme Court cases, getting back to what is most basic. And I want to, in the rest now, give an example of what that would look like. So I'm going to use Socrates. This is from the Apology. Plato's Apology, the trial of Socrates. So that's relevant, right? He's like before the Supreme Court on trial. And he says, someone will say, yes, Socrates, but cannot you hold your tongue? Stop speaking. It's freedom of speech, right? Can't you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city and no one will interfere with you. So you've kind of ruined yourself here in Athens, but hold your tongue and you can go to Corinth or Thessalonica. And there you could live without bothering people. Just hold your tongue. Stop having freedom of speech. Now I have a great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this. For if I tell you this would be a disobedience to divine command, and therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I'm serious. Remember the story. One of his disciples had gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked, who is the wisest? And the oracle said, Socrates. And so he took that as a commission from the oracle, which is speaking for the god Apollos, to find out who is the wisest. So it's a divine command. So if he was to tell them that, they would say, oh, you're not being serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is to daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, and that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, that you are still less likely to believe. And yet, what I say is true, although a thing of which it is hard for me to persuade you. So look at the second part there. The first part about divine command, you won't take that seriously. But think about the second part. The greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others. Remember the story. He'd gone to the three main groups in society, politicians, artists, craftsmen, and asked them if they know or they only think they know. Are they wise or they only think they're wise? And guess what it turned out? They didn't know. They thought they're wise, but they didn't know what is good. And that's what made them angry with him. He exposed their pride. And so in contrast, so he says, look, isn't this the greatest good, though, for humans to find that out about yourself? Because that's what he concludes. The wisest person is he who, like Socrates, knows when he doesn't know. That's what the oracle meant. And that's our greatest good. So Socrates here brings this idea up of the greatest good for us. What is our greatest good? Wouldn't you like to discuss that with people? Now think about the kinds of conversations I've been talking about where people aren't even able to speak to each other. It's usually not about that, is it? It'll be more like about this policy, this international policy, this taxation policy, right? Now, someone will say, no, but those are very important. Well, I mean, they're very important to you right now, sure, but they come and go. Probably couldn't name taxation policies from 50 years ago, let alone 100. But the greatest good doesn't come and go. What is it? If you can't talk about that, or if you can't know what is good, not just have factions, but actually come to knowledge, then what's the point of free speech? We don't need it then. I'll be first in line to give it up if we can't know what is good. The greatest good. So I asked earlier on one of the first slides, why should we care about free speech? Why should we want to dialogue? Well, Socrates puts it as one of our greatest goods in order to live the examined life. Now, I'm going to suggest he didn't go far enough. This is a kind of negative stance. I know that I don't know. Okay, not enough. We need more. Think about John chapter 1, where the Apostle John famously speaks about the logos, that Greek word, logos or logos, translates the word. That's speech, isn't it? Freedom of speech in the beginning of John's gospel. God spoke. Now, this parallels Genesis, right? Where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And it'll say God spoke and God said. The speech, why does God speak? Does God have freedom of speech? The Word was with God, and the Word was God. What does a word do? Well, a word makes known what is invisible. This whole time I've been speaking using words that you understand to make my invisible thoughts known to you. You can't see a thought, right? I'm thinking them right now. Can you see them? Oh. You can't see thoughts. So we make them known. We make what is invisible known by the word. The word is that by which God makes himself known. The same was in the beginning with God. Notice what happened there. Things had a beginning. The word was already there. It didn't have a beginning. The word is eternal, without beginning. And that's what we see in number 3. All things were made by him. That's a shift also. You might say it in the first 2 verses. Now him, personal. All things were made by him. Could the logos have been made? Do an argument in your mind. Draw an inference. The logos made all things. Could the logos have been one of the things that was made? No. The logos had no beginning, was eternal. Without him was nothing made. Not anything made that was made. And I want you to think about 4 and 5 especially. In him was life. And that life was the light of men. Life. Now, that doesn't mean physical life, does it? We'll see that in the very next verse. Those could be in darkness, but alive physically. They don't have the logos, but they're alive physically. It doesn't mean physical life. The life of the mind, spiritual life. And that life was the light of men. That's a metaphor we use often for understanding, isn't it? The logos is that by which we understand anything. The light of our mind. So speech and thought together from the beginning in John's gospel. And so in verse 5, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. You could be confronted by this logos, and you don't understand it. What is freedom of speech worth to you then? What will you be saying if you don't understand the logos? What do you want to say? This is why some have said the highest philosophy is silence. Those same ones that would say there is no logos, there is no comprehension, you must silence your mind. And if your mind is silent, do you need speech? The idea is not that you silence your mind and you're still going around yammering. All speech, all thought has ended. So think about that, how John, for us, connects up speaking with the logos, also translated reason. And it's that by which we understand. Now, go back to what we were just saying. 2 sides, the slides divided even. 2 sides unable to speak to each other. Now, many times at the human level, they're both wrong. Here, though, in verse 5, we're not talking about both wrong scenario. We're talking about the light shines in the darkness. Now, Socrates was enough of an example that they hated him and they killed him. And all he said was, I don't know, but at least I know I don't know. And his execution was relatively peaceful. He drank hemlock and went to sleep. Let's look at another example. Stephen from Acts 7. Now, Stephen, I'm abbreviating this for you, but it's a wonderful speech. You should go and read it yourself, the whole thing. He goes through an entire history of the people of Israel, including the law that was given to Moses, on down to the present. And he says this, and this is a step beyond Socrates. Think about this use of free speech. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You're just like your ancestors. He just gave a history of their ancestors and how they turned to idolatry. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Remember John 1:5. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You who have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. Remember, I said freedom of speech is the right to and obligation to rational discourse. Socrates gets us to, I don't know. But there's another, you have an obligation to know. Stephen gets us there. You should have known. You were given the law. You were given general revelation, and you didn't know the Logos. You did not comprehend it, and then you blamed the Logos and killed him. And because of this, he has a very violent execution and is stoned to death. How about that use of free speech? Does that go beyond obscenity laws and whistleblower laws to cut to the heart of our condition? That's the use of free speech. Where are you? Have you known what is good? Or have you disregarded it and treated it lightly? And you haven't comprehended it. So, conclusion. Why do we want to speak? Why did God want to speak? The creation of God, God making himself known through his works, through the word. And we want to make ourselves known and others known. Want to make our ideas known. We want to come to have knowledge, right? We don't just want a bunch of opinions that produce endless factions. We want to come to know. So what are some action items to take away? Well, lead the examined life by knowing your own basic beliefs. Could you even identify those beliefs? Get to know yourself. Take yourself out on a date. Get yourself a Frappuccino. Where would you go? Red Lobster. And get yourself a lobster meal. And just get to know yourself. What are your basic beliefs? You might not even know that. You might start with beliefs that aren't basic at all and have to work backwards. Next, do not think you know when you don't know. That's Socrates. Don't think you know when you don't know. And if you're not sure, you can come talk to me and I'll show you don't know. In other words, you can know you don't know right now. You don't know what is good. You might get in a general, like if I threw a dart, I might hit that back wall. That's not enough for knowledge. And third, do know what you ought to know. Do know what you ought to know. That's what Stephen gets us to. What you were given, and you disregarded it. You don't know what you should know. And so when you discuss freedom of speech, it becomes secondary. People get into tiresome arguments over and over and over. And you're not getting back to basic speech about basic things to know what is good. Socrates directed us to that. Our greatest good is in discussing, but not just in discussing, but coming to have knowledge. So use your freedom of speech, the press, religion, to come to know things. Thank you. Now, I should add that the next talk on dissent, Socrates was a dissenter. And we're going to look at examples of dissent. Why should we tolerate dissent, and when is it important? Good. All right, stop the recording. And you can ask questions. Now, it won't be recorded. Any questions for me? Or say, no, it was so tight, not one question is left. You anticipated all my questions. Yeah. So the question is, are you, Dr. Anderson, saying that free speech shouldn't be protected for people who don't know what they should know? No, I'm not saying that at all. Of course, I'm saying that's why you need free speech. It is in order to come to know things.
So is it okay to like have people that online talking out loud, even sometimes pressing others by misunderstanding or just kind of what we see today in politics can be good, right?
Yeah, like hot air.
Yes.
Well, here's the implication. You have an obligation to use reason, to have rational dialogue, which means, in relation to that, you have an obligation not to listen to what is irrational. Why would you want to listen to that? Change the channel. Are you obligated? Listen, I mean, someone just is walking along on the street yammering. Do you have to listen? But now they've been given an official job and they're yammering. Do you have to listen? It's nonsense. In his speech, Friends, Romans, Countrymen, Mark Antony says, judgment has fled to brutish beasts and men have lost their reason. I mean, would you sit down, you see a pasture of cows and they're mooing at each other? Do you sit down and try to translate and figure it out for a few hours? It's nonsense. It's not a language of any kind, right? I'll say of any kind. It's not a rational language. It's more like alarms or alerts or something. So you have an obligation to avoid that. You have an obligation to avoid foolish arguments. And I think we like to get into those sometimes. We run into them ready. I'm going to show this guy. As a cartoon I saw, guy's on his computer typing furiously. His wife says, dinner is ready. And he says, just a minute, someone's wrong on the internet. Yeah, got another one for us?
Yeah. What about I ask people that question.
Good.
In terms of, obviously it's different if you're like Facebook, right? It's a business. We can monitor whatever they want and limit speech there.
Yeah.
It seems like there's like a huge moral implication when they do, right?
Yeah, there's some other thing. I think that's probably what people will be interested in doing is, well, what about Facebook and Twitter? What about them? Well, there are some problems that happen when you create a monopoly. And you control not just the Facebooks, but also the platforms to start any competitor. Like you own those, so you can kick competitors off. But even then, what do you want to have free speech to talk about on the Facebooks? The good life? Are you doing that? I don't know. If it means you narrowed it down. Now you might say, oh, so Anderson's going to regulate what counts as good speech and not good speech. Not Anderson, but there's a truth of the matter. Right? How do we usually spend our time? What do we usually spend our time talking about? And do I have to listen to you? Go on about your favorite TV show, which we know that would be Cobra Kai, and I'm okay talking about that. But what if someone wants to talk about this failed thing called WandaVision? And I was like, no, let's get back to Johnny. So yeah, Facebook, I know that would be interesting, but Facebook and Twitter, and they're regulating. Political speech. All right. So follow me now, right? I was back at Madison and Jefferson. We agreed, everyone here agreed, we have more divisions now, which means we haven't been using our freedom of speech to resolve differences. We've been multiplying differences. So now Facebook is getting involved and shutting down some people's ability to speak in that division. That's an outcome of having failed at this other level. And are we redirecting our speech then and saying, you know what, we don't even have an agreed upon good as a group. And if we don't have agreed upon good, then maybe we should just split up. We can't even agree that we both liked Breakfast at Tiffany's. Right? So, I mean, some people could say that's what salvages the relationship. Remember that movie? That was a great one. We don't even have that. Yeah.
What do you do when you have a society that doesn't want to pursue rational dialogue?
All right. So the question is, yeah, what do you do if you have a society that doesn't want to pursue rational dialogue? Now, this is not just an intellectual versus the masses talk. No, because the intellectuals may not be doing it either. In fact, they might have been the ones failing this whole time. So this is not just some professor talking about how great professors are and the unwashed masses aren't good. No, not at all. I'd be more with Madison and Jefferson on the ability for the common person to think well. But what do you do if they're not interested in that? You're going to encounter what Socrates encountered. And you're going to encounter, if you press it further, what Stephen encountered. Now, from what happened to Stephen, a man named Paul came to be a believer and went through his own levels of persecutions. He himself was killed a couple times, actually. How does that work? Yeah, you should read about it. Stoned to death, gets up, and then later is executed by the Romans. So, yeah, what is your Socrates said the greatest good is in discussing virtue. Is he right? What if we had that discussion? I don't think he's right, honestly. The greatest good is not discussing virtue. But I'm glad he brought it up. Let's talk about that. Let's have a rational dialogue about that. So what if you start your own community that does that? You're free to do that, right? That was one of the 4 freedoms in the First Amendment. You're free to assemble. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask if you thought like Twitter innovation or Facebook or both Twitter and Facebook
We're a faction? Yeah, I guess they could in terms of James Madison's. The question is Twitter and Facebook like a faction as defined by James Madison? Yeah, they have an interest that they're pursuing. Usually the way we protect is that we have multiple businesses competing with each other. So what happens when you have a monopoly form? We've had that before in the United States history. And we've had to deal with monopolies because then it's not enough to say, oh, it's a free market, just start your own Facebook. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. Yeah, right. Yep.
They would be Democrat, I think, based on their views, but their majority, that doesn't matter for a faction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and think about the kinds of speech on Facebook or Twitter that we're talking about, right? What they want to do is limit speech that leads to immediate violence. It's not clear they've done that at all because there's lots of other people in the world who aren't being censored, who are trying to lead to imminent violence. So that's where the political side comes in. The political opponents, they want to silence.
Do you think, I had a question on censorship, like President of Mexico kind of said that he didn't agree with Twitter, and I was curious what I don't know if this was about the censorship too or not.
Did he say why?
Censorship. He said that government has that authority to censor people. It's more
Yeah. So in other words, the government and the oligarchs have been at war for a while. So is it the business person who owns a monopoly who gets to censor, or is it the government who also owns a monopoly who gets to censor? But the things that they want to censor aren't the kinds of things I brought us back to, right? I don't know that they'll have much interest in censoring, talking about whether or not the good life is virtue. What has existed from eternity? And worse than that, bringing us down to John 1:5, the light has shined in the darkness has not comprehended it. Connecting that up to Stephen, it did not comprehend it to the point of killing the Messiah, to silence the Messiah, to silence the word. So there's a battle between the word and the darkness wants silence. Stop the word from speaking. So that's a little further than Socrates. That's going to get in there and call people to have integrity. Good. Other questions? Any others, or we're set? All right, good. That was good discussions. I'll still be here for a little bit. We'll shut down this part. Thank you for joining me, everyone.